Welcome to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. In each episode, we dive into the world of industrial cybersecurity. Join us as we cover the latest trends, innovations, and practical insights as we talk with leaders and practitioners across the industry. Gear up and let's get into this week's episode.
Hi, my name is Dino Busalachi, and today I have Dan Cartmill from TXOne. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Dino. Great to be back. Good to chat again. Looking forward to chatting today about some vulnerability management stuff.
Yeah, why don't you give us kind of a brief rundown of your background and your role at TXOne?
I do product and content marketing here at TXOne. My background, I took a little bit of a different path, I guess, to get to where I am now. I actually started on the practitioner side about 17 odd years ago in the IT security space, and did that for a while, held a number of different roles as a security practitioner, security analyst, moving into consulting. And then I moved to the vendor side, did some pre-sales work, product management, and now moved into product marketing. And that's what I do for TXOne. I help describe how TXOne's products can help with the challenges that organizations are facing in the market.
Yeah, TXOne's got a very unique offering with the technology, I believe. I mean, we've been looking and chasing in our role, putting in a lot of these OT intrusion detection systems, right? Which was kind of the first phase of this, OT cybersecurity journey. And then TXOne coming along several years ago has been able to say, yeah, we get that and we're a part of that, but then how are you going to deal with these vulnerabilities and risk as you uncover them in the manufacturing environment around OT assets specifically? So what do you think is one of the biggest misconceptions about OT vulnerability management?
Yeah, it's the perfect starting point, and your setup there is perfect for it. I'm often seeing a misconception between gathering that list of vulnerabilities, doing a comprehensive scan, even if you're able to scan every asset, that somehow that is the end goal. That once you have that list, once you have that good understanding of what vulnerabilities are there, what exposures you have, what your risk surface is, that you're a significant amount of the way complete on your OT security program. When in fact, you've just created lists. There's still a lot of work to do, and the real work of actually reducing that risk is still to be done. And we see a lot of organizations that have deployed various tools and they do a great job at helping identify it, but they find themselves stuck in that gap of what have we got? What are we going to do about it?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of mistakes that organizations make is they think that OT environments can be treated the same as IT, right? And when it comes to vulnerability management, and the reality is that they run on legacy systems, they have uptime requirements, limited scanning and patching. So, and they're sensitive to changes. And that's where we see this, the gap, as I call it, between IT and OT. And we can get into the whole IT-OT convergence conversation as we go through this discussion and our thoughts on that. So, and what do you think are some of the blind spots on OT vulnerability scanning?
Yeah, so OT vulnerability management as a whole is just less mature than its IT counterparts. So in terms of the technologies that exist to be able to go out and scan various devices in different deployment patterns and whatnot, it's just less mature. It hasn't been around as long. There's not as many vendors in the market kind of driving a lot of that innovation and whatnot that moves technology forward. So from a starting point, it's just less mature. Another, I think, significant part behind that is how we actually do the scanning. So there's the ongoing debate of passive versus active scanning and all of that. But how do you make sure that all of the devices that exist in your environment, and whether or not they're connected all the time, sometimes they might be intermittently connected, sometimes they might be air gapped. How do you make sure that the approach that you're taking actually collects all of that information as it's doing its, let's call it a sweep? So the blind spot I think that comes from that is the more perhaps IT-like approach of we expect these systems to be generally online and responding to that scan, that sweep. When in OT, a lot of the times, either that device isn't going to respond for various reasons, it's not able to because it's not connected. What that can give you is an incomplete picture, I'd say, where at a point in time, you may have 60% of your assets. You scan again the next week, you might get another 60% coverage, but it's a different 60% because different devices might be online or available. Some might be bought online for a specific part of a process that's happening. And that means that you're going to have outdated vulnerability information from the devices that didn't get rescanned. You're going to have new information that you're going to have to try and consume and work out what to do with. So I think the big blind spot is treating it like OT is your picture is never going to be complete. There's still too many gaps, immaturity in tools and their ability to see all these devices. So there's more steps required, more due diligence required in making sure that you do have all of the information so you can make your decisions on what you're going to do about that.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. The OT assets are not easily discoverable, that's for sure, right? It's just their architectures around those control systems are different, and it's also an area where it's a blind spot for them because they're truly unsure of how that stuff is put together within those environments because they didn't have a hand in it primarily, right? And nobody's wrong here. It's just if you weren't involved with the development, design, implementation, and in the ongoing maintenance and support of these systems, it creates a blind spot for IT. It really, really does. And we have this saying, it's like you can think globally, but you got to act locally, right? Meaning that you have to be able to work with people within the four walls of these facilities or at these sites that have inherent knowledge, right? The tribal knowledge of these control systems and how they operate, how they work, potentially how they're put together. And even sometimes the plant people aren't really sure how everything is put together. They know where it's at, but they don't necessarily know how it's connected or where it's connected. And we run into that a lot in the work that we do. So let's talk about finding vulnerabilities different between OT and IT. What makes those different?
Yeah, so perhaps to level set out, a lot of tools that do this kind of scanning work is the vulnerability has to be known. So there has to be some kind of intelligence, some kind of detection logic built or something like that that can identify, scan a particular device, run a set of detections, for lack of a better word, against that to understand what is it vulnerable to. Is it vulnerable to these particular exploits? Does it have this missing software that would make it vulnerable to these other ones that are listed? But it all comes back to it has to be known. So in our IT list, of course, we have a ginormous list that's continuing to grow all the time, but it's very large in what we know exists out there in terms of vulnerabilities. For OT, it's just smaller. So there's been less research done on these vulnerabilities that exist. There's less researchers, less threat researchers that are doing active investigations into the vulnerabilities that exist. So for the first part, it's more difficult to do OT vulnerability detection, vulnerability management, because there is less threat intelligence around what are the vulnerabilities. So the result of that is, even if you were able to do a complete scan, you had an excellent tool that was able to do a complete scan of your environment, every device, let's just assume for a moment that was possible to do, there's still a fairly good chance that there's a whole bunch of vulnerabilities that it just doesn't know about, that we just don't know about yet. They're just waiting for someone to exploit them. So in terms of finding those vulnerabilities, our initial mindset should be it's unlikely that we're going to have the complete picture. We're not going to have as granular knowledge and level of protection as we might have in that IT environment, simply because there's not as much research there. How to kind of move toward doing something about that, though. So it's one thing to say, yeah, you're going to have less visibility.
Yeah, and they all know they have them, right? The clients know that they've got risk with these assets. They know
exactly. Exactly. The way to move forward with that knowledge, with that acceptance that there is going to be a good level of unknown, is rather than act purely reactionary, firefighting mode, when, say, a new vulnerability is announced. These devices are vulnerable. It's a priority 10, have to go and take some kind of action and jumping to the response there, because that type of announcement is only going to increase as more research is done, right? As we see it in the IT world, where every couple of days there's a new high criticality one that needs to be done. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty quick way to just drain your available resources, right? Is just jumping through and trying to go and do more scans to identify what is vulnerable. Instead, taking a more proactive approach, and that comes from understanding more about the environment, as you were saying, getting that plant knowledge of how these systems are put together, what they connect to. But instead of looking at individual vulnerabilities, look at the classes of vulnerabilities that exist. So an easy one to visualize, cast our mind back just a couple of years, Eternal Blue. So we know that that worm went through SMB v1. So instead of trying to find all the devices that are vulnerable to that, a more proactive approach to that would be to simply disable SMB v1. Not saying that that's necessarily possible inside of OT, just as the example, but that blocks the entire class of attacks. So all the derivatives that came from that or used Eternal Blue, you have a mitigating control in place already. So that can help you focus your efforts and the limited tools and resources that are going to be available to block very large portions of the overall vulnerabilities and exploits that exist without having to look at each individual one, and knowing that when the new one comes, there's a good chance you might already have some good protection there, buying you some more time to do that analysis with all the other work you have on your plate.
No, good point. And we're going to talk, specifically about how TXOne's tackling that problem, because some of the other things that I would add is, the OT teams, they can't afford taking downtime to take on these updates and these patches. There could be regulatory restrictions that are involved. There could be vendor lock-in, where the OEM's telling you, hey, you can't touch my machine if you want to, if we're going to keep your warranties, maintenance and support in place, And so outside of the risk, the fact that the vulnerability is out there, it's a 10, it's being exploited, they still can't move quick enough to do anything about it, and because of the things that I just mentioned. So that being said, let's talk about how TXOne and the technology that they bring to the table can actually help solve some of those problems. So how does TXOne look at going after these vulnerabilities we're talking about without being disruptive into the environment?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways, and we do it slightly different between some of our products. It's the same philosophical approach that we take. So in Edge, our network security product, we use virtual patching, is what we refer to it as. There's a number of vendors that provide these kind of technologies. It's a time-tested, very robust system that's just very good at what it does. So the way that that works is essentially for network exploitable, network detectable, I should say, network detectable exploits using deep packet inspection, various other inspection capabilities. It looks at all of the traffic going through. If it matches that particular exploit, it simply holds the last packet. So legitimate traffic continues to pass through the device, but if it is an exploit, it's blocked. It's as simple as that. So if that particular vulnerability, if the exploit for that particular vulnerability can be detected via the network, virtual patching allows you to put that patch in place off of the device. So you offload it from the device itself. That's virtual patching in a nutshell. For the endpoint, so Stellar, TXOne Stellar, our endpoint agent-based product. So this uses a slightly different approach. So because it's an agent, it's based on the actual device itself, it's more app lockdown based. So it does a baseline scan of that particular device, the endpoint that's hosting that agent. Does a scan of that, understands what does it normally do, what applications generally run, what network connections is it making, what system I/O is occurring on it, and it creates that baseline pattern. So then, instead of specifically looking for security events and taking action based on a security event, detecting a threat, but pattern filters, things like that, it instead detects any deviations from that baseline. So we have the known state of what this device should do, and just don't let it do anything else. So by doing that, it can prevent those vulnerabilities, whether they're known or unknown, from being exploited in the first place. So this is TXOne's philosophy, so the operations first philosophy that's applied in both of these products, where the security perspective is very important, and that can help us find targeted threats of more advanced things. But the operation perspective is equally important, where the deterministic nature of many of these actual industrial processes, by their very design, they are far more deterministic in nature. If we can accurately map that, we can restrict the network activity, the endpoint activity to just that. So it's more taking the approach of eliminating process variations and special process variations as opposed to detecting security threats alone. That's how we look at the prevention aspect of it. To circle back to your original question, how do we deal with vulnerabilities in this? How do we identify and detect them?
Well, there's two things to this. There's detection, and it gets back organizationally. Who is best suited to really to do this, right? To be able to map that out and make sure that you're not being disruptive by putting these technologies in line, right? Able to, to provide the vulnerability or virtual patching, if you will, and not be disruptive, right? To make sure you're not breaking anything, and safe operations, process integrity, as you mentioned, organizationally. And what have you witnessed with the TXOne rollouts on who's best at handling the deployment of your technology on the plant floor?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. The answer, not so simple, because I think it comes down to a few different parts. So it should be joint. Both teams should be having input, but it's more in the realm of what a security engineering team would do, as opposed to what someone on the plant floor may do in their normal day-to-day job. It's more related to the security team, but it has to be informed by the restrictions and guardrails from the actual operations side of it. But that said, there's always the risk of inputting a policy, applying some kind of a configuration that causes unintended side effects. So the technology itself, the actual tools themselves have to be well designed to limit that just by their very design itself. So making sure that they have the ability to do bypass. If power is interrupted or a configuration change pauses scanning, that the actual traffic itself doesn't get interrupted for a network-based appliance. And then inside of an endpoint agent, and we can use Stellar as the example there, it has inside of the console the ability to override. It's like an emergency stop button on the Stellar agent to make sure that if something time critical, safety critical, operation critical is happening, the person right in front of that particular device doesn't have to pick up the phone, try to get to the security person to get them to revert a policy or change something. They can stop it right then and there. So it's about having the products and tools designed to support the way that the operation needs to function with appropriate controls around that so it's not abused and whatnot. But it's a combination of both. It probably does sit more with the security team, but it needs to be well informed by the operations team, really working very closely together and well-designed products to make sure that as many things that can go wrong are removed before they could go wrong.
Most of these control systems aren't designed with security in mind. Safety, yes, security not so much, right? And so now we're talking about, how do you get that local plant team knowledgeable enough to know what's normal? It's like a control system within a control system with security wrapped around it, right? And having multiple players potentially involved, which we see with firewalls, right? We see that with firewalls and we see that with networking, where you have those external parties that have the ability to manipulate the flow of traffic and communications amongst those control systems, which, to your point, disruptive, can cause loss of product, could be safety issues, people can get hurt, get killed, you could have damage, whatever it might be. And so that relationship has to be really tight between those two groups. And you get into that IT/OT convergence conversation, and there's usually still gaps, right? Because the IT team, that InfoSec team, we want them to be more inherently knowledgeable of the processes, right, within that plant. And that takes a different level of knowledge and skill within that manufacturing facility. Even if you have 30 plants in your fleet, no two are the same necessarily, even though you might be making the same products, but you have different control systems. They could be of different versions, different makes and models of automation technology out there that are being used to make those same products. So that local team, in my view, has to have a role in being able to really pull this off, in my perspective.
I absolutely agree. And as you were describing that, something popped into my mind that the situation that a lot of security teams, IT security teams, find themselves in at the moment, it is the shoes on the other foot. The analogy I'm looking for there, where and I was guilty of this when I was a practitioner, I'll admit that. We wish that the organization knew more about security, knew more of why we were doing things, why that control was in place, and why they shouldn't try to work around it. We wished that they knew more about that, and we got frustrated when they didn't, and they worked around the control, caused an issue, clicked that link in the email, whatever the case may be. What we're seeing now, and as you just described, it's the IT security team now needs to learn more about the process.
Mm-hmm.
So they're being asked to do what they were asking others to do. And
Right.
it's not an easy journey to make. It is a completely new domain of knowledge to learn. It is taking you outside of your comfort zone, right? So you don't get to IT security and high positions in IT security without having been in the industry for a while. You kind of maybe a little ego kind of coming into that, making that transition and admitting and saying, you know what? I don't know enough. I don't know enough about that. I need to go and seek out that information. Of course, most IT security folks are very inquisitive people just by their nature, but it is a significant step to take to say, I don't want to start doing things here until I've learned more about it. I'm going to have to go and be vulnerable with these other teams of experts, essentially saying, hey, I don't know what I'm doing here. I need you to teach me.
One of the things that we've witnessed is that, I'll say two things. I'm a believer that, a CIO or a CISO, the InfoSec teams, need to probably get a better handle on who's working in their plants, right? Because in any major manufacturer has got several or dozens of different OEMs and system integrators working in their manufacturing facilities at any given time, right? And so they need to start thinking about building a relationship with those groups. And I'll tell you why here in a second, because how else are they going to know what the overall OT cybersecurity strategy is that the organization is trying to pursue? How do you get that message into these third parties that are in there working in your plant? And so that's one, right? They need to build relationships with a lot of those folks because a lot of manufacturers today, from a controls perspective, don't have controls engineers. They have process, they have operations, but they're not the ones necessarily programming those control systems per se. They're relying on these third-party engineering companies or OEMs to do that. And so that's where that relationship really needs to get tighter between IT leadership from a CISO role and that InfoSec role and the partners that they have to determine what are your capabilities, what partners you're working with, like is TXOne, part of your partner community, what practices do you have from an OT cybersecurity perspective as an engineering company, so you can leverage that within these environments to help close this gap that you and I are talking about.
What just popped into my mind there is in terms of finding that and then finding it, understanding if you have all of the information. So we can map out a large list of all of those that we're integrating with our third-party providers, the different technologies, tools we have, who is looking after what particular parts. A great way to test that is to do things like tabletop exercises. So develop out plans on, okay, well, we want to do a simulation for this particular system, our inventory management system going offline. Do we know everyone that we should be calling? Do we know who their backup is when they're not available? Do we know what systems this is integrated in, or if the loss of that system will cause impacts in other systems? So, I mean, that comes up all the time. There's a big auto manufacturer dealing with something probably similar to that, where it wasn't necessarily their OT systems that were impacted, but the IT systems that may not be connected to it were impacted, and it caused a flow-on effect. Right. Making sure that all of that is mapped and being able to have those plans, disaster and recovery and BC plans in place, it's really important. Tabletop exercises, while they may seem a little goofy, especially the first time you're doing it, if you're doing a good role play of it, they can be really good at finding the gaps in your knowledge and helping you patch that and really get a good security program that's battle tested in place. So when the time comes, not so much if, but when the time comes, you really know what to do about it and you're not running around with your head on fire trying to work out who do you call first.
Yeah, it's interesting. Incident response. We work in manufacturing facilities every day, all day. It's what we do. And I can't think of any client that's actually said, here's our IR plan if something of a material breach was to unfold while you're here. None of them have it. Now they have, what's interesting is when you think about safety, before you go on site, there's safety protocols or safety training. Where do you go if this alarm goes off or if this alarm? There's ones for tornadoes, there's one for ammonia leaks, there's there's one for fire, where's your mustard point? They go through all of those types of exercises before you even get to start on site. But I've yet to see one that says, here's our incident response plan if we have a cyber breach within the four walls of this manufacturing facility.
It really should just be a part of that. Maybe the process for developing the safety-based responses, maybe it's the same kind of a process. That's a well tried and tested. There's a lot of standards out there to help guide that. It's the same thing that we're doing in creating that process. It's just a different topic that it pertains to, but that's how the frameworks and standards are written. So you can use it in different situations. Maybe that's a great way to look at it, and that's a great way to get started on it. Look at what you've already done, try to adapt that to the security part.
So Dan, as part of it, as we're wrapping this up, what would be one piece of advice or takeaway that, for our listeners that could take away from this conversation?
Yeah, so no one's claiming that vulnerability management is easy. It certainly is a task that needs attention, and it's not going to be something that you can knock out in a day. The important thing, I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is always why did you start doing this in the first place? What happened in the organization? What triggered you to start doing vulnerability management, to track the vulnerabilities and then remediate them? Likely answer to that is some kind of security program was designated. So maybe you've been tasked with OT security. The big takeaway of that is never forget the original objective of that security program. So if that security program is about reducing risk, reducing the chances of outages, keep in mind as you're deploying various technologies that you may not be as close to that as you think you are. You might now have a complete vulnerability list, but that isn't the original objective. Your objective wasn't to get a big list of vulnerabilities. It was to reduce the risk. So how do you make sure that you're continuing to take those steps and you're not seeing the big list, leaning back in your chair and saying, we're good to go? You have to tie that to the action to keep it in line with your original objectives. It's very important. Don't get lost along the way.
Yeah, I have found that when these tools go in, the events and alerts can be overwhelming. I was talking to a very large life sciences client the other day. They average 8 million events and alerts. Think about that, right? 8 million, and so how do you deal with that, right? And you have, maybe AI is something that, is a mechanism that can come in to help you really to try to prioritize and organize such a massive amount of information you're not used to seeing. Right? You haven't seen this before. Now you've got a pile of it. It's a mountain high of it. And how do you start tackling that problem? Right.
That's a problem that, absolutely exists. It is one that there are some interesting solutions that we can probably take from the IT world in just detection engineering kinds of processes. AI might be the answer, but it's definitely not going to be a silver bullet. So look at how have you dealt with huge influxes of events in other deployments of tools. You deploy a new tool, suddenly you're getting hundreds of thousands of new events. How do you deal with that? Maybe apply that same knowledge in how you're dealing with these new events. Identify what information do you need to make sense of these, go and gather that from the experts, then implement that same engineering process to start filtering them out. Then you can move forward on that prioritization. Don't try to prioritize a list of 8 million. Try to prioritize a list of 50. But how do you get it down to that list of 50?
Right. Very tough. Well, is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to cover as part of the topic? Maybe you have something around 0-day vulnerabilities or anything that maybe we overlooked or?
Yeah, very quickly, perhaps on 0 days, it's similar to that last topic there. There's going to be a lot of noise about them, always. So the media, vendors, they're going to make a lot of noise that, this new 0 days here, everyone panic. First, take a step back, take a breath before you do anything on there. Don't buy into the hype. A lot of these industrial systems, especially as we were saying, they have a lot of safety built into them. And in a lot of cases, that can help protect you. So everything's not likely to explode the second that 0 day comes out. TXOne, so we do some work with the Trend Micro 0 day initiative. It's a great source of threat intelligence. But as I was describing in how the products themselves work, where they're looking at the deterministic nature and they essentially lock it down to that and just detect deviations from what the operation should normally do, that can help prevent even 0 days from causing impact to your operation. So Vault Typhoon is a good example of that, where the Vault Typhoon attacks came out and everyone was panicked and worried. Well, we already had protection against that. We'd already had a few detections of that happening in customer deployments where it was a non-event. They were stopped. The activity they were trying to do was simply stopped before it could start. We didn't have to have a signature or a pattern for it. It was something that the operation didn't normally do, so it blocked it. So taking that operation first approach can really be helpful in handling 0 days because, again, they're never going to go away. There's always going to be a new one. And you can bet your bottom dollar that it is going to be hyped to the moon every time one of them drops.
Well, thanks, Dan. It was a great conversation. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dino. Hopefully I come back again soon.
Thanks for tuning in to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. To stay up to date with our latest episodes, be sure to click the follow or subscribe button now. And if you found this podcast helpful or have a topic you'd like us to discuss, please leave us a review or let us know. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.